everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Dance Experts, more specifically dance and neuroscience experts today, which I'm really, really excited about. For those of you who haven't already picked up on the fact that I find neuroscience so fascinating, because for me, it's like the link between the mind and the body. So in so many ways, we kind of like separate them, like physiology and psychology, but neuroscience is like all encompassing. So I'm obsessed with it, and I'm really excited to have a neuroscientist on finally to talk about it. So Marieke, thank you so much for being here with us. And please, can you give us a little bit of an intro into your work in neuroscience and then also the dance side of things?
Right. Yeah. So thanks so much, Natalie, for inviting me. I've been really a fan of your podcast, so I've been enjoying listening to previous episodes. I'm very honored to be part of it this time. So I like to call myself a computational cognitive neuroscientist. So I'm somewhere in between psychology, neuroscience, and computer science. I actually work in the AI department. I make computer models of cognitive processes, and then I test those in human participants. And I try to learn mostly about when, how, and why we get distracted, and when mind wandering is helpful and when it really makes us go into unproductive cycles. So it's also a little bit of an intersection between basic research about how cognition works and more applied research, clinical research that tries to understand the problem of, in particular, depression. So I'm really fascinated by those and by that, and I'm collaborating with researchers in that department. So I guess that's the very, very brief version of my research. In addition to this, I also do a little bit of what's called two-person neuroscience research, where I try to understand what it means when the brains of two people who try to do something together get synchronized. It's a very new kind of field. My results are not that encouraging. For it might be more noise than signal, but we can talk about that later. But anyway, it's at least it's a very interesting thing, this sort of social dimension of neuroscience. And then in the dance side of things, I'm also a very passionate classical ballet dancer in my free time. And I really, during the pandemic, I realized, well, normally I'm cycling to work every day. I need to move. So I dove much deeper into ballet, and it became really a much bigger part of my life. And then I was like, I kind of really like that. I want to keep it. So I kept up the more intensive ballet schedule, and it's now been sort of weaving into my work in different ways, which I'm very happy about. So I'm trying to figure out how to be both, well, maybe like a dancing neuroscientist or something like that. So
yeah. Thank you so much. Oh, I want to get into every single thing that you just mentioned there. But first of all, yes, I love the fact that people in different disciplines who do dance are interested in like asking the questions of dance inside their field. Like, I think that's so exciting, because dance as an academic subject can sometimes feel a bit like constrained. So it's really exciting, I think, to have people who love to dance who are in different areas of academia. So I love that, first off. But let's start with distraction. That's such a fascinating topic and very important, I feel like, for everybody. I mean, I think about, how often I get distracted, why I get distracted. And I'm really curious to hear your definition of where it's useful, where it's not useful. How can we notice when we're on one side or the other side? Can we start there? Because I think it's fascinating for everyone, myself included.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, I love this topic because in a lot of psychological research, we try to really very tightly control what a person is doing by having them do a computerized task. And distraction is really about where you can't control this anymore. So that makes it so fascinating. So basically, maybe just to explain that first before going into what is distraction and when is it not, or when is it useful. The way we measure distraction in a lab or mind wandering is we give people typically a boring task. Well, that's not hard because most of the psychology tasks that we do in a lab are pretty boring. And then every maybe 1 minute or so, we pop this question on the screen that asks the person, what are you thinking about right now? And then you tell them ahead of time that they should be as honest as possible, that it's fine if they're distracted because this is, you know, what happens. It's very human. And what you find is that about 40% of the time, people report thinking about other stuff than the task. And that when they do so, they do worse on the task. So in this context, distraction is quite well defined because it is like not doing the task that the psychologist set for you, the neuroscientist. You also find that actually the brain at the time of reporting such mind wandering or distraction is not responding as much to the incoming stimuli. So normally when you see something, your brain has this little blip, or actually also your pupil widens a little bit when you see something, and all those responses are sort of reduced as if your attention is turned more inwards, which I think it is. So it's sort of disconnected from the external environment at those points, which I think in general is also not necessarily bad. I mean, probably it has evolved for a reason, right? So mind wandering is not necessarily bad. I think we constantly have such a thought process going on in the background, and if our external tasks or demands are not sufficiently important, then these internal processes just take over. And one of my colleagues called it the task of life, right? It's the important questions that we maybe ask ourselves, and also to disengage from the immediate moment to maybe question also, is what I'm doing relevant, important? Should I maybe be engaging with more important things? So I think in that sense, distraction can be very helpful. Where it becomes less helpful is if you do this in a situation that really does require your constant attention. So if you're even in traffic, most of the time it can be fine to engage in traffic unrelated thoughts, and we would be robots if we wouldn't do that, right? But if you do so at a moment that there is suddenly traffic coming from an unexpected direction, then that can really cause problems. So one of the most important neuroscientists working on mind wandering, Kalina Christoph, told this story of how she was asked to testify in court for a case where a woman had completely missed a car coming from an unexpected direction and engaged in a car crash because it was the birthday of her husband's passing, and she was so engaged with that internal thought that she literally did not see this car coming. So it was what I just actually talked about, is brain not responding to incoming information to an extreme that she completely didn't see it. And there you can see that it does become problematic. And it also becomes problematic, and this is the part that I'm researching, when these ongoing thought processes, we also call them spontaneous thought processes, when they are going around and around in the same circles but not really getting anywhere. So one example where this is very common is depression, where people go in these circles of, I'm worthless, my life is worthless, whatever I'm doing is not gonna make a difference. And then that is not really gonna get you any further to, solving a problem, getting better, making a contribution. It will just make you feel even worse about yourself. And that is, I like to call those sticky thoughts. So I'm very curious about how can we see the effects of those sticky thoughts on task performance, on the brain, on our in eye tracking, sort of really all the biomarkers of that, so that when we can track it better, that we can also see like what is the effect of different interventions, so that we can hopefully help people get out of these unproductive cycles of sticky thinking.
Wow. Yeah, that's so fascinating. It wasn't the type of distraction that I had originally thought, which is now so common, which is like intentional distraction by devices or things that have been programmed to distract us. But this is, as you said, spontaneous, where it's just that it happens internally. So this is so fascinating, and I'm wondering how this relates to movement. I don't know if this is part of your research. If it's not, I'd love to just hear your thoughts as a human being. Because thinking for myself anyway, if there's something that I'm doing that is people don't like this phrase, but I'll use it just because we all know what it means, like in the muscle memory, where like driving might be one of those. Like if you're literally so familiar with the route that you're driving, like you've been driving for ages, you know your car, that we're almost like on autopilot. But then I'm thinking of myself in the dance studio, if I'm doing a very different type of movement or a new sequence or something that takes more of my concentration, like I can't go into the spontaneous thought because the movement is really engaging so much of my brain. These are just my own random thoughts. Like, are you thinking that some of the answer for how to interrupt sticky thoughts might be in movement? Is that a place that would be interesting to look?
For sure. So I must say that I haven't done research on that, for the simple reason that it's very difficult to figure out how to productively do that. And also different people respond very differently to movement. So for some people, these kind of movement interventions might be, including myself, I would say I'm self-medicating with dancing to combat these sticky thoughts and get in a completely different mind space. Because basically what I think, and not just what I think, but I think there's some reasonable evidence to believe that a lot of these spontaneous thoughts are just driven by a brain area that's called the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. So these are areas really in the middle inside of our brain that are crucial for memories, and they sort of constantly sort of throw little thoughts into maybe our subconscious, and then they're being censored most likely by a brain region called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So probably the reality is a bit more complicated, but this is sort of the rough sketch. So this is what's happening, and now we know that this hippocampus the way it tends to retrieve memories is by means of association. So if you're in a particular corner of your mental space, then you tend to retrieve associated memories. So this means that if you're in a region of your memory space that's quite sticky, and very often this is when we get into self-evaluative processes, we know that these are particularly sticky. So I've also done some research based on that. The moment we ask people to do some self-evaluation, like even give them personality words and ask them to judge whether that applies to them or not, that already makes them more likely to get into these sticky thoughts, because then they might start to retrieve sort of recent experiences that are like also questioning these personality traits, and then they start to get into this self-referential thinking. So this is a particularly sticky region of memory space. Now, I think movement is a very powerful tool to get us into a different mental space, which would then potentially be a less self-referential space. Now, where this wouldn't work is if people already are the kind of people that feel very self-conscious about movement, and then will start to question themselves even more, then they get probably even more stuck in this self-referential thinking. So it's very hard to actually back this up with research. So this is just me combining different theories and my own human experience. But that's what I would say, because like I do classical ballet, I think we briefly mentioned. And so in ballet, especially, as you also know very well, you use so much of, you could say, of your mind. I kind of always dislike you use so much of your brain, because you use actually a lot of your brain all the time, but a lot of it is subconscious. So this myth that you only use 10% of your brain is just untrue. The only thing is that your brain uses most of it by itself, and maybe only 10% of it is conscious. But actually, there's a massive amount of energy that goes into the brain, but that's like little side point. But you use a massive amount of your mind when you're doing ballet, because you have to memorize the steps. You have to be conscious of your fellow dancers. You have to remember like what kind of muscles to use when. And so, of course, hopefully after some time, you're starting to delegate. And some of this becomes procedural memory, which is like, well, the what did you call it just now? But like driving
muscle
a car,
memory.
it's just automatic. Muscle memory, thank you.
Yeah.
So muscle memory, but of course in ballet we also constantly try to improve our muscle memory and make it even better. Like even professional dancers, as far as I've heard, they continue to sort of hone their muscle memory of their movement. So there is a massive amount of involvement of the mind, and then you also maybe try to express emotions even in simple exercises. So there's so much going on that you almost can't help being brought to a different mental space. And also, if you're sensitive to the music, for me, that's really a big thing. That if there's beautiful music playing and there's a teacher that has a nice vibe to them, then it really brings me in a different mental space. So I think movement, because it's so immersive, can be a very powerful way to really change your thinking. Also because I think in movement you're going a little bit beyond your conceptual thinking. You really can go into more subtle feelings that might not even have words to them. And yeah, so this is actually something that I was actually working on today. I gave a lecture in a program called the Embodied Critical Thinking program. That is a big across university collaboration that I'm part of with the University of Iceland and the University of Vienna and Haifa University and some others. And there we also try to explore this dimension of thinking that's rooted in the body. And can we sort of find new ways of thinking that are not just our conceptual thoughts, which is basically the whole university is all about just conceptual ideas. And it is almost as if we stop like here, we only a walking brain and then there's no body. But sometimes if actually, even in disciplines like mathematics, you also rely on intuition. And the intuition, actually, that signal is inside the body. So if we can become more conscious of it, we could maybe amplify it and then thereby develop new creative ways of thinking. Now, of course, all of this this is based on some work by mostly in the philosophy discipline, work by a philosopher called Eugene Gentlin. And so some of the colleagues that started this embodied critical thinking process, one of them is Donata Schiller, who's written about that also from a philosophy perspective. And we still need to test these claims from how you can interpret this in a cognitive framework, but this is my current sort of understanding based on, again, my own experience and the ideas in cognitive science that are around. So I think really the body has a lot of wisdom, but we're not so used to sort of listening to it.
Yeah. Well, it's really exciting to hear people within academia, first of all, just acknowledging that, like, hey, we've been using mainly the here upwards model, and we're interested in doing the whole thing now, which is really, really exciting. So first of all, thank you for like being so open and inquisitive about that, because it's really, yeah, I feel like, because there's such a big embodiment thing, but it's just outside of academia. And so the fact that these bridges are coming to like crossing now is so amazing. And I think there's going to be so many wonderful things that come out of it. What I was thinking as you were explaining there was just about how so much, as you said, like we can tap into emotional parts of us and other things, but the way that I see things anyway is just that everything is patterns in the end, or disrupted patterns. So the patterns that we have from childhood, or even patterns of posture, like even if it's not movement, but like when I get into this thought process, I tend to be sitting like this, or I'm doing something else, or and then looking at how, okay, what if I were to do a different pattern? What would that change my thoughts? And I think, at least I didn't used to believe that you could change your thoughts from like the body up, which is so ironic because, you know, I was using my body all the time, but I was just like, no, my brain controls everything, you know?
Yeah, no, and I think it totally does. Like your posture makes such a difference. And yeah, for me, that part actually was always kind of obvious from ballet, but for me also, as weird as it sounds, maybe, because ballet is the form of dance that's probably most academic and focused on this is right, this is wrong, and so on. But for me, still the most important part, as much as I love getting into the details of technique, I do that actually too. I love to geek out about little muscles and exactly how these motor patterns work and try to figure out how to make my body do them. But then the emotional part is still the most important part. I love just how, when you, even also when you're feeling certain emotions, or when there's certain music and you express that with your body, it just changes how you think. So this is also what we were trying out today in this embodied critical thinking lecture that I was giving, which was actually not a lecture because it was moving. So I played music, and then I invited people to explore with their body. I mean, on the one hand, explore just, how they could move their body in response to the music. So how can you move your fingers, and also how does that make you feel, and how can you move your toes, and how does that make you feel, and how can you move like your torso. And it's really interesting how that really makes a big difference. I mean, with ballet, you can do it too. Like when you do like rond de jambe and you do it en dehors, it sort of can have this expansive sort of opening yourself to things. And then when you do it en dedans, it can really feel sort of closing yourself. And it's so interesting. Such very simple movements, they can have a big quality on how you feel. But then also it's not a one-way process, right? So it interacts with each other. Then the movement affects the thinking, but then the thinking also affects the movements. I also find that with the body, you sort of can't really lie. If you really feel not good, then you will notice it in your movement, or other people, well, at least ballet teachers or dance teachers will probably notice it in your movement. So that also makes it really interesting. I think that's why we humans also make use so much of like body language to find out the hidden meanings as well. I think Dutch culture is maybe not so bad because we're quite direct, but in some cultures you have to rely a lot on body language to find out what people are feeling. Like I can imagine that in UK, where you were growing up, right, or something, that you need to rely a lot more on body language to find out what a person really means.
There are some very subtle like facial expressions or gestures, and the words are very polite. So and then I honestly I love Britain. I love British people so much, but there's something that for me is a little bit more freeing in the Spanish society, where it is a little bit more direct as well. There's definitely a level of like keeping the peace as well on top of that, but you can certainly just be more direct with people, and I appreciate that, because that's how I am, like just as my personality. So it's a really interesting observation. I think maybe, you know what, I'm thinking about one of my friends who's also from the Netherlands, and maybe that's why we get on so well. But there are some aspects which I guess are cultural, some aspects which are personal to each person, and then the decoding of all of these things. So I also want to ask you about, because there are so many things that we could talk about, but I would love to hear about this synchronization, because one of the places where like my expertise is in the dance world is in synchronization in terms of rhythmic body movement. So I'm fascinated if there is any mirroring here of synchronization in the brain, and if it's looking like, you know what, we were looking for it but it's not there. That's also equally as fascinating in some ways, because how is it then that we could potentially be synchronized in our movement but not in our brain? Like, that's super interesting as well. So what have you found so far?
Yeah, so I still have to write up these results. It's one of those papers that's on my pile of things to write. Fingers crossed here. But what basically, just maybe start with the less encouraging message and then get to the more interesting bit. So the less encouraging message is that one of my PhD students has been working on really very nicely controlling everything in the lab in a task where people have to coordinate their choices. So they have to, they see 4 different stimuli, and both of them see this set of 4 stimuli, and they have to choose the same thing without talking to each other. So the way this then should work is that over the time, as they are making choices, they see the other making choices, and then they are like, oh, they're probably using maybe the contrast or the color, or they choose the most blue stimulus or something like that. So they start to think about how they can coordinate their choices with the other person. And when you do it that way, really there, and then when you do the analyses really properly, then there's basically no interbrain synchrony. The only interbrain synchrony is really there just driven by the fact that they're doing the same task, but there's nothing more added to by the, you know, how well they coordinate with each other. So that's one thing. That's the more depressing side of the story. It's such a beautiful story that, you know, when we're trying to do something together, our brains sort of do similar things and they sort of sync up, and then that allows us to do stuff together. But it might be more complicated than that, which is probably true for most of, you know, neuroscience. The more you get into it, the more complicated it turns out to be. But now I also did an experiment with dancers. You know, that's, and one of the great things of being an academic is you just can come up with a creative idea and then try to find some funding. And if you manage to get the funding, you can just do it. And so I was like, okay, I'm curious about how brains synchronize, and especially the differential contributions of the body and the mind. So I collaborated with a dance collective called Random Collision, which is called Random Collision. It's actually here in Groningen in the Netherlands where I live. And it's a random collision of scientists and dancers and musicians and just beautiful people that are all interested in collaborating. It's really great. And they've been exploring social connection for a while. So this was perfect at the time when I got this grant to study interbrain synchrony. And so what we did was we worked with the dancers to try to explore how can you connect with another person physically and mentally, and what are the different ways in which you can do it? Because the ways I thought, you know, a dancer would connect with another dancer would mostly be by synchronizing their movements, and then that might synchronize your brains, and then you see more synchrony, and then they also feel more connected. Now, we explored this through a very interesting series of interactive performances that we did in theaters throughout the Netherlands, where the dancers were dancing together and we were recording their brainwaves and also telling the audience a little bit about this whole setup and getting their ideas. What we found with the dancers was actually, I mean, this was a very challenging thing. So for the brain data, we couldn't really conclude anything because the data were just too messy. I mean, you get into practical problems like dancers sweating so much in the stage lights that the electrodes just fall off. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about the stage lights, you know, and things like that. And then the dancers getting so much into it because of the adrenaline that they just almost pull off the electrodes from their head. It's very interesting research. We learned a lot about how you do and do not do research with dancers, but the dancers also really, what they taught us so much was so many more ways in which you can connect through movement. And for them, the most powerful ways of connecting through movement were, first of all, to completely drop the idea of a self and to really tune into almost a sense of emptiness, or where the ego is completely almost dissolved. So this has a bit of a background in like Buddhism, where I'm also a Buddhist practitioner, and the dancers sort of had that experience too, and meditation. So this is maybe a bit more complex, but on a more practical level, they also felt very strongly connected. And this was also a bit more visible in brainwaves in a follow-up experiment with non-dancers that were, wearing EEG, but slightly more constrained circumstances. So we would have less messy data. That they were moving in dialogue. So this was a very powerful way to connect, both subjectively speaking. So if you ask people how connected do you feel, as well as in the brain. So to the extent that we found increases in interbrain synchrony, this dialogue where one person moves and then the other person moves in response, and then the first person moves. And the other way that was much more powerful than moving synchronously is moving but touching each other and then trying to feel as if you're a single body. So that's a lot more powerful than just, moving separately but in sync. It still helped to be facing each other. That increased both the feeling of connection and the interbrain synchrony, but really the hands down most powerful ways were this not moving synchronously but in dialogue, as well as the moving synchronously but really feeling as if you had a single body, sort of losing almost your individual self. So I thought that was very interesting. So the way we did this also was that we got this idea from the dancers. So we used the experiments we did with the dancers and the series of performances to then create a lab experiment that we then did with something like 25 or 30 couples that were both wired up to EEG, and then they had to make their movements just with their hands so they wouldn't move their head too much, and then we got better data, and also they would be more generalizable to a population that doesn't necessarily have a background in movement. So I love that you've done it on both dancers and quote unquote non-dancers. My thing, we're all dancers in my opinion, but it's good to have both sides of the data. It's so fascinating. So in some ways it sounds like there's something akin to a conversation, and obviously movement was always our first language. I had this conversation with Peter, and he was talking about that body is obviously that movement was always our first language, and we see that with our pets and other things. So that makes so much sense that there would be almost like a conversational type thing. Like, is there? Let me ask this: what are you actually measuring in the brain? Like, what areas, or how does it work? Because that's something that I'm like, I don't know, it just looks like waves on a screen. Yeah, exactly. So this is a study with EEG. So EEG basically measures the very weak electrical signals that the brain cells communicate through electricity. I was just talking about this in my introduction to the brain lecture this morning. So very well timed. And basically, you can imagine that we have about 86 billion neurons in our brain. So we only, of course, catch a fraction of their activity when we put electrodes outside the skull. And really only those brain cells that are sort of a whole bunch of them directed in the same or oriented in the same direction and fairly close to the skull, because otherwise we just wouldn't detect it. The places where we got this interbrain synchrony, I don't really remember exactly. So far, most of the time when we get it, it's either in sort of the frontal part of the brain, but then we don't really know exactly where it comes from, because EEG is a measure that has very high temporal precision, but very low spatial resolution. So you don't really know exactly where it comes from. And it's usually either in terms of interbrain synchrony, either in the frontal areas of the brain in alpha waves or theta waves. Those are the ones. So theta is about 4 to 9 hertz and alpha is about 9 to 14 hertz. Or you find them in the back of the brain. And these alpha waves actually in the back of the brain, interestingly enough, are also associated with mind wandering. So when we're mind wandering, and especially when we also disconnect from the external environment, we tend to see these in an individual person, of course, now I'm talking, they tend to increase now. And this alpha waves in the back of the brain can also synchronize to the brain of another person.
Wow, there's so much to it. Can I just ask some very basic questions that I just always wanted to ask a neuroscientist? And these are probably going to be so basic for you, but hopefully for people listening who are not neuroscientists, it might be helpful as well. So I have questions about, so we can measure weight, human beings, we know how to measure brain waves, etc. Are there ways of measuring simultaneously hormones? And is there a way of doing like what's going on in the brain versus what's going on in like the blood and other organs simultaneously and like mapping those together? Is anyone doing that? Is that a thing? I'm sure it probably is, but I'm just like, oh, wouldn't it be fun?
That would be totally fun, but I don't know whether you can actually measure hormones in real time, because I would say hormones and blood, probably you need to puncture the skin and get in there. So that would be pretty challenging. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I think you can. So interestingly, these brain waves that I was talking about, to some extent, I've heard they also occur in other parts of the brain. So there have been some studies that were like measuring the heart oscillations and then linking them to brain oscillations. So this is a bit about the relation between the central nervous system in our brain and the peripheral nervous system in the rest of our body. There are also, actually, I'm quite interested in heart rate variability, which is quite related to this idea of sticky thinking. So we know that healthy heart rate variability is relatively high, and people with depression, for example, tend to have lower heart rate variability. So in some of our studies, we're also focusing on that.
Would you mind just defining heart rate variability for anyone who's not sure? Because I have an idea what it is, but I'm not going to give a very good definition. You'll do a better one.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's many specific ways to quantify this, but roughly, I mean, of course, our heart beats at a certain rate, and when you exercise, it gets faster typically, and when you're sleeping, it might go a little slower. But so that's the average heart rate. But then you can also look at how much does it change, and that would be the variability of the heart rate. And interestingly enough, if it's a bit more variable, maybe it's some people think it's like associated with like mental flexibility, and that's why people with, for example, depression tend to have lower heart rate variability, lower heart rate variability, and that's associated with sort of a lack of mental flexibility. So yeah, that's on maybe a more intuitive level what this is.
So
and then of course
it makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah. And then of course there are other kinds of signals that we can catch on the outside that are related to emotions. I mean, the outside of the brain, I mean. So like maybe skin conductance. I would say that that's also the kind of thing that people are working on. But yeah, hormones, I would say, are very challenging, but I'm not an expert on this. So
thank you so much for entertaining my question. I'm guessing it's on the way. Like, I'm guessing there'll be something soon that's going to be inside the skin or something. I don't know, but I'm guessing. I mean, they're doing all kinds of fascinating things at the moment. Yeah, thank you so much for entertaining that. It was just a thought that I had. So let me ask you, like, from that research, and I know you said you're going to publish it soon. What's your main takeaway from it? Like, what's the thing that you learn about human beings that you find most interesting from gathering all of that data with your dancers and non-dancers?
I would say that for me, the main message here was that actually the way we connect with each other most powerfully is not through synchronizing with each other, but really maybe my sense is that really the things that require us to pay real attention, because when you're in a dialogue, things are unexpected, like you can't sort of do that mindlessly, right? And the same when you're moving as if you're in a single body, you sort of can't really do that mindlessly. Whereas moving in synchrony, even like in an army or things like that, and even in ballet class or other forms of dance, you can sort of tune out a little bit. But the moment you're in this unpredictable situation, trying to tune into each other, that's really the most powerful way. Maybe that's also like why jazz is such a powerful way that humans like to be with each other, or improvisation in general. So I found that for me, that was the most interesting thing, and especially also because it's in a way also related to my research on mind wandering. So you would probably not engage in mind wandering at those moments because it's sort of so interesting, this situation, that you constantly things are changing and you have to tune in. Yeah,
that's so fascinating, and yeah, I see how that links now. I love that you've done that research and it's obviously coming out how powerful those things are. I have this other intuition, and that's all I've got, because I ain't got no scientific research to back this up whatsoever, only firsthand, what do they call it now? Me search, something like that, which is not a real thing. That if we're thinking though about transcendence as being part of movement as well, which you kind of mentioned when you were talking about Buddhism, this experience of like transcendence, is there any part of that where mind wandering would be like advantageous versus this very focused, like I'm here in this present moment and I'm with this other person and there's that kind of thing? Is that a possibility? The reason I'm asking is because I believe that rhythmic synchronicity, is extremely powerful. I just believe it's powerful in a different way. And one of the ways we know is that like that is very often, if you look at tribes and things, or just other practices where we have this synchronous movement of feeling like at one with a larger thing, or like losing that sense of ego, which you also talked about. So I'm curious if part of the transcendence experience would be, or like altered states of consciousness, would that be going along with that side, or would it still be for transcendence that we still need that kind of very focused attention on what's happening?
I would say actually the very focused attention on what's happening, I guess there's different ways to get to this transcendence. It seems to me, but I mean, I think transcendence is one of those topics that in terms of research, it's very hard to research, and people don't have they don't agree about definitions. Actually, they don't even agree about definitions of something more simple like mind wandering. So okay, that. But from my experience, and I've also been doing a whole bunch of research on meditation, and I'm quite in this field as well. Transcendence is probably related, almost defined by this loss of a sense of self that can arise in many different ways. And so it can be like when you're on stage, I think for me, it's so precious that even as an amateur dancer, sometimes I get to be on stage, and then there are these moments that you can be completely just the dance, and you're no longer there, and you're just there for the audience, and that's the most beautiful feeling ever. And so that's one way, and that can be arising also maybe from this like drumming experience or getting into a trance, this very powerful methods that are used by indigenous tribes. And so it can be probably arrived at through different means, and in a way it's also one of those things that's very hard to control. Like you can have set your intention during the performance to really go for it, and then still you don't know whether the magic will happen or not. And the same is true for different kinds of meditations where you're really going in trying to go into these states of pure awareness, but almost the harder you try, the less you get there. So you have to also let go of all of this effort. So it's this kind of a magical feeling that you cannot control. It's probably also similar to flow. Like in sports, it often, I think it arises in the case of extremes. It also, of course, happens when like people run ultra marathons or even marathons or extreme sort of exertion. And I think that's one of the reasons that with dance, it can also occur quite commonly, because you're very often going through extremes of your body and trying to get there. And then afterwards you feel a lot better. At least I guess this is also why in some way I'm self-medicating with ballet to counterbalance my academic life and the stresses of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for like sharing all your thoughts around that. It's so fascinating. I'm wondering now that you've just said all of that, I'm wondering now, maybe there is a difference then also between like the transcendent nature of dance, which can occur, but then there's no telling if it actually will. As you said, like sometimes the factors just have to all kind of coincide, and human beings can't always control that. And then this other aspect, which is this feeling of being really connected and at one with the other people around us. And that actually transcendence doesn't need to be in the equation for that. I'm just thinking, no, it doesn't. It's just that feeling of oneness or like deep connection with people. So thank you for like allowing me to during this conversation have these kind of like put these new thoughts together. I'd love to finish talking about ballet, which we've talked about a few times already, but you've said the word self-medication a few times, and you know, let's talk about let's frame movement in that way for a moment, because I think it's interesting for people, because you know, we think of medication as other things, not as movement. But how is it that you've come to this realization that actually it's part of some kind of like medicine for you?
Yeah, it is interesting because in a way I don't really know. For me, maybe I got into ballet when I was about 11, and through some random way of just reading a book, and then it seemed fascinating, and I just went into a ballet school, and I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Well, clearly in a way it didn't happen, but in a way it did happen. It did. Because I'm not a professional dancer, but I dance almost every day. And I sometimes also perform. I mean, the most awesome recent experiences were that they happened in India, where I was invited not only to give a talk, but also give a ballet performance, which is so special, to share ballet with people in a different culture that don't even know about it. And then to they somehow they're also mesmerized by the beauty of it, that somehow seems to transcend cultures. It's very special. Anyway, and then I love dancing, and I love it when people enjoy watching that. So that's the magic of that. But it's not just about the performing for me. I think what's been drawing me over the years, because that was, well, I guess I've been doing ballet for more than 30 years now. And it's this combination of, on the one hand, almost going into a different world where with the beauty of the music and trying to reach to this ideal, which, you know, also you will never reach. And then I guess the advantage of being an amateur is that it's completely fine that you will never reach there, because nobody is paying to see you, or, you know, you don't, it's not your job. So you can just enjoy being in the process and being forever in the process. And also, I think movement in general is something that, if you're sitting still all day, it's really nice to have something to do with your body, so that it sort of refreshes your mind. At least for me, if I don't move, I had some very powerful experience when I was in China at a tour to represent our university in different places. And so we were literally being shoved in a bus, put on a plane, shoved in another bus, put in a hotel, shoved in a bus, put in a like stadium at this exhibition thing. So I was literally almost not moving. And I after a few days, I was like, it can't work. I feel not right. And then I started to move in my hotel room, and I felt so much better, even just doing 5 minutes of, I think, a lazy dancer tips, like video, and I just started to dance a little bit. So that's when I realized that having this regular physical expression, touching, also finding different parts of my body sort of makes me feel more like a complete person, and also continuing to explore. So I think one of the reasons I became an academic is I just love learning. And what's interesting about ballet in particular also is that there's so much intricacy to the movement that you can never stop learning. There's always some new sensation to feel and to find, and trying to get new insights into how to make your body move these ways and how it affects your mind. So it's a never-ending exploration. So yeah, I find that always very enriching. And then finally, it also puts me in a different headspace. So when I have a lot going on, like right now, I feel like I need to move even more, because it's more powerful than doing, like, I also practice meditation, but sometimes with meditation, you're sitting still and you're sort of almost in the same headspace still as you do since the other stuff you also do sitting down, at least I do. So then it's like when you're moving, you're almost in a different place, at least for me. And yeah, so that helps.
I love that. It brings us full circle to where we started. I feel like saying that there are signals from the body up, like, hey, we're doing something different now. We're going to feel differently. We're going to think differently, and it can happen both ways. So I love that. I have one final question that you have no idea what this is going to be. So there's no pressure to come up with any kind of fancy answer. But soon as you've been in, academia, because you're this lifelong learner, I can tell that's your approach to everything that you come across in life, and it's mine too, but I went a different route. What are you excited about for the future of academia, and what will it take for us to get there in your kind of vision?
Interesting. In a way, I don't really think too much about the future of academia. I do hope, though, that so one part of the vision is a paper that I recently submitted with a couple of colleagues, is an academia that's a bit more kind and compassionate, where we really prioritize those values over sort of what tends to now be overemphasized, is really just this quantification of how many publications did you get, how much money did you get, how much, all that stuff, which is, I think, not what academia should be about. And it should be about human relationships and kindness. And for me, that is fundamental. So I hope that we can slowly move there. I think there are lots of discussions, at least, to refocus academia onto those more human values, and also really focus on the interesting, exploring, learning stuff, rather than just like producing stuff as if you can quantify new ideas. I mean, it's not the same thing as producing, I don't know, bread, or producing anything that you would produce cups or so that's one part. But now you're asking this question, and we're talking a lot about movement. I as I'm involved in this embodied critical thinking process, it would be so great if we could also have valued that dimension also in academia, and to realize we're not just walking brains. But I think that suffers almost from the same problem as this, what prevents us from engaging in this, or emphasizing more these qualities of kindness and compassion and joy also, honestly, and play, maybe. Like, I think you've also been talking a lot about play in your podcast. And so that is the, this idea of, well, movement and how that is important for our thinking is very hard to quantify, because it's so different for every individual. And also ideas like the creativity of an idea, that's again hard to quantify. So those, I think, probably a lot of people do feel they are important, but they're not so measurable. So this is why they are not emphasized as much, and they don't get as much attention. So it would be great if we could give them a little bit more attention, and maybe also that will make our students feel a lot better. Because today I did a poll in my lecture and asked students how they felt, and I think something like between 20 and 30% of students actually said that they didn't feel great at all. So the options were, how do you feel? I feel good, I feel okay, and I feel running up against the wall. I think that's how I phrased it. And like between 20 and 30% said they were running up against the wall. It's like, whoa, okay, that's not good. So I think we need desperately those kind of things that prioritize mental health over the competition focused society that especially the students are feeling, I think, a lot of pressure. So maybe tuning into the signals of our bodies can also really help us to prioritize this, together with just the emphasis more on human qualities of kindness and compassion.
Thank you so much for like sharing that vision. I find it so amazing, and perhaps not a coincidence that those same conversations are happening in the world of like professional dance training, and they're happening in the world of academia. Like it must be time. It must be time for us to be like, let's come back to humanness. Let's come back to not only valuing what can be easily measured just because it's easily measured. And that I love that, you know, there are people like you in the world, you know, inside the walls, who can be kind of a voice for those values. And also, you know, you're literally practical research and the paper that's going to come out. So I just want to say, you know, on a personal level, thank you so much for being that person and for like embodying those values inside of your work.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think also there's a lot of commonalities in that respect between the world of especially ballet and academia, which are incredibly competitive and incredibly hierarchical. And yeah, those are just risk factors for things to go wrong in that respect. So I hope that well, I'm sure actually I don't just hope, but I'm confident that there is a lot of interest in changing things, and there's a lot of people that are really working on it. So it takes a long time to change habits, but you know, we can do that, which is even shown by the fact that adults can learn ballet, right? They can improve in ballet even when they're adults. So we are adults and we can change.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all for that. Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. This has been so fun. I have a feeling that people will maybe want to be following along with your work. Is there a particular place that you would like to direct people to?
Yeah, so I have a website, so you can just Google my name and you'll probably get to the website. So this is where, if you want to follow my academic publications, you can find them. If you're curious about what I do on the ballet and life side, I have an Instagram where I sort of have the habit of posting pictures of myself in my different academic travels in some ballet poses, and then I say a little bit more about what I'm doing. So I guess that's a more informal and fun part. And then if you want to hear my opinions about academia, you can also follow me on Twitter, where I tweet more academic, interesting papers and thoughts about papers and stuff. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll make sure to have the website, Instagram and Twitter linked in the description, so it's easy for everyone to find. Marieke, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. And thank you everyone for watching. Let us know if you have comments, questions, just anything that you would like to share with us in the comments. And I will see you in the next episode of Dance Experts. Bye.